it seems to me like the US administration as well as the British administration are refusing to leave the sinking ship that is the Zionist project. So, I mean, one question is, I mean, it does seem like the Zionist project is doomed. Why are they so interested in remaining tethered?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think historically they've always been tethered. There is somewhat of an emotional connection to the idea of Zionism. You know, you had Lord Palmerston, for example, a sort of a Christian Zionist inflection within the British political elite, which even preceded the development of the Zionist movement. You're talking in the 1800s, early 1800s, 1700s, you had elements of it. But again, I think what's been built up over these decades has been a level of integration which we are quite far from fully understanding the majesty of. Meaning that the integration is massive. And so Israel is simultaneously a settler colonial entity, but it's also, literally speaking, a military base for the United States and a military base for Britain. So through that status within the region, they're able to project influence. But what you're speaking to is interesting, because as the decline of that influence is happening, which is the inevitable course of human history, the return to a more natural equilibrium in the world is the decline and the retreat of US and British influence in that area. Where does that leave Israel? I think Israel is going to be placing a lot of hope in India, as projected to be, you know, by some projections, obviously you have China overtaking the United States as the world's number one economy. Some projections have India overtaking the United States as the world's second largest economy. Now, that process is going to mean that, you know, particularly the BRICS alliance is going to have more of an influence on what does and doesn't happen. And Israel is putting a lot of effort. You know, one of the interesting things about what has happened in this war is, at the beginning, after Tawfan al-Aqsa, there was rage on the Israeli side because Ali Baraka from Hamas had come out and said clearly, we have licenses to locally produce Kalashnikovs and bullets for Kalashnikovs from the Russians. He said, we have been told by the Russians that they are going to teach Tawfan al-Aqsa in Russian military schools.
Wow.
The Israelis were enraged about this. And so then in November, they started applying some of the US sanctions onto Russia in the banking sector. What else do you have? You have, you know, you can understand why something like that may have happened, because the Israelis were arming the Azov battalion through Elbit systems with Tavor rifles in Ukraine. So there's a tit-for-tat kind of process possibly playing. The other thing the Israelis did is they stopped informing the Russians before airstrikes in Syria, which previously had been happening. What's the other side of this? The Israelis claim that they found Chinese weapons in Gaza. What else happened? So China begins to operate on Israel what Israel perceives to be and interprets as a sanction regime, where China ceases to send things that can be used for military and civilian use, dual use. So components that Israel could integrate into its weapon systems stopped coming from the Chinese. The Russians are saying, the Israelis are saying, how is that possible? Why is this happening? In addition to that, when Israel cancels the working permits of, you know, the amount of Palestinians that worked daily in Israel, and not just Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, that were essential to the Israeli economy, cannot be underestimated. Even just in the construction industry, you've got 60,000 Palestinian workers there. Okay? They cancel those permits overnight. who does Israel turn to plug the gap? So first it goes to the Chinese. Now at that stage, there were 30,000 Chinese workers in the entity. What happens? 20,000 of them are called home. Only 10,000 of them remain.
Wow.
Israel says to China, send us more. China says no. What else happens? China refuses to condemn Hamas. Israel is furious. What else happens? China has built the Haifa port for the Israelis on the basis that Chinese companies would have significant control of the port.
Right.
What does Israel do? It hands over 70% of the control of the port to an Indian billionaire. So there's, in a way, a shadow war playing out here. But what is significant also is that after the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, we did not see Putin or Xi Jinping at the funeral. Why? So what's happening here? You even look at why is it that the Yemeni armed forces have been able to do what they've done in the Red Sea? Why? It is because China develops the comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, where they say over 25 years, we're going to invest 400 to 500 billion in the Iranian economy. Therefore, we are going to solve the issue between Iran and Saudi Arabia, thus ending the war in Yemen. China does that, the war in Yemen ends. What happens? You have groups in Yemen who are able to assert themselves on the Palestinian issue. This is all interesting. But where does Israel turn to fill the employment gap? Turns to India. The largest armors of Israel in this war, the United States, Germany, Canada, Britain, India.
Wow.
The future does not belong to the United States, Britain, Canada, and Germany. It doesn't. The future, as in the next 50 years, India, China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil. Look at those relationships. Brazil calls it genocide. South Africa calls it genocide. Russia, ambiguous, frankly speaking.
Yeah.
China, ambiguous, but ultimately more opposed than others, we can say. That's the future. So Israel's looking at BRICS and thinking, how can we form relationships that can see our way out of this? You know, it would take, but what they're attempting is impossible. Many would look at it from the perspective and say, okay, you who are trying to fight against Zionism, you're attempting the impossible. Actually, what the Zionists are attempting is impossible. How are you going to sell this to the rest of the world, let alone to people of the region? They can integrate, you know, the key thing about the Abraham Accords, which I think has been under-analyzed, was it was about integration of economies and militaries. Integration of economies and militaries. I'll tell you two key ways in which there's been integration in the region between Israel and Gulf partners. So number one, the same company Celebrite, which hacks phones for the British police, which is an Israeli company, hacks phones for Pakistani intelligence, used to hack phones for Russian intelligence prior to Ukraine, hacks phones for, even the Venezuelans, but also hacks phones for the UAE and the Saudi government. Okay, so in terms of sovereignty, you are outsourcing the surveillance of your own citizens to an Israeli company. It's not just NSO, which is also the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. What it revealed is that normalization has happened. Is this conceivable that a Saudi citizen has his phone hacked by an arm of the Israeli government, which is the NSO group Pegasus for the Saudi government? And you say normalization hasn't happened, but there's more. There's more and it's worse. There's more and it's worse. The UAE has shares in something called Highlander Aviation. Highlander, and when I say the UAE, it's Edge Group, which is a UAE state-owned military company. It is a part owner of Highlander Aviation, which is an Israeli drone company, which manages Israeli airspace. the Saudis set up something with Jared Kushner called Affinity Partners, a hedge fund, which Kushner said, which bear in mind, Kushner, when we step into the Trump and the Netanyahu and Kushner thing, Netanyahu used to sleep in Kushner's room.
Wow.
When he visited the United States. That's how close the families are. So Kushner sets up Affinity Partners. He describes it as a corridor for Gulf investment in Israel. It's a joint project between the Saudi government, the UAE government, and Jared Kushner. What does it own? What does it own? It owns $2 billion worth. No, it owns less than $2 billion. It owns a large portion of something called the Shlomo Holdings Group. Yeah? Now, Shlomo is an Israeli company which builds their ships for the Navy and has also armed the Shaudag unit of the Israeli military since October 7th. That's Saudi money.
Wow.
There's an integration of the military systems in the region off the back of the Abraham Accords.